All right. Hello and welcome, everybody. So, my name is Martha Alter Hines, and I today am very honored and happy to be in conversation with Dr. Claudia Ford. So, Dr. Ford, Claudia, is someone who I've been um, wanting to connect with for, I think, almost 2 years now. Yeah. You're a good friend of Heather Ensworth, who introduced me to you. And I reached out to you almost 2 years ago, I think, something like that. And you're so busy and you have so much going on. And now just it happened to work out that we actually get to connect. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Martha. Thanks for your patience and for inviting me to this. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm going to read your kind of official bio, but what I was saying to you before we started recording is that I've listened to several talks that you've given, and um something that has many things have struck me about them because they're all incredibly powerful, passionate, deeply wise. There's many layers to your work, to who you are as a being. So much I feel listening to you. But something that actually has struck me quite strongly is the way that you in some of those talks introduce yourself. Um, and I feel like I almost want to honor it by not describing it, just let it be what it is. But yeah, anyway, I just everybody will see once you do it. So
Okay, that sounds great.
um, but first, I will read your official bio, or one version of it. Okay, so Dr. Claudia J. Ford has enjoyed a career in international management, development, and women's health spanning 4 decades and all continents. Dr. Ford holds an undergraduate degree in biology and graduate degrees in midwifery, business administration, creative writing, and a PhD in environmental studies. She has been in academia for over 20 years and is currently professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Studies at State University of New York at Potsdam. Dr. Ford conducts research and teaching in ethnobotany, indigenous knowledge, gender studies, and the sacred feminine, sustainable agriculture, spiritual ecology, environmental justice, environmental writing and literature, and international business. She serves on the board of directors of the Soul Fire Farm Institute, committed to ending racism and injustice in the food system. Claudia is a visual artist and writer, and she has been so blessed to share the joys and adventures of her life with her 4 children and her grandchildren. And I know there's much more than that.
Well, thank you for reading that.
Yeah. So I would love for you to introduce yourself in whatever way you feel called.
Well, thank you. I mean, I often start by acknowledging that right now in my life, I'm living on the territory, the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee people in Upper New York State. And actually not that far from kind of the center of the Haudenosaunee territories, but very close to the Seneca people. So that's a privilege to be here. I'm near Buffalo or Niagara Falls, across the border from Toronto. So to locate me in this particular place right now. Um, and I also like to remind that, I am the daughter of Vivian and Stanley, and the granddaughter of Tina and John and Elsie and Seth, and also a great grandchild, as we all are. I had the fortune to actually know my maternal great grandfather, who did not die until I was 17, I believe. So I knew him quite well. So that was a blessing. Um, and yeah, I grew up in both New York and Virginia, right after the peak of the Great Migration, when African American families were escaping, Jim Crow and extreme racism and lynching in the South. So in my case, in Virginia, and my family's case, and moved to the industrial North. And again, in my family's case, that was New York City. So I grew up in New York City, but with very strong ties and periods of time living in very rural, very segregated Jim Crow Virginia. So that's also an important part of who I am, because I grew up in that segregation way into my childhood before it was legally abolished. And and then as well, my children, my own children, have very much been a guiding star for my life. So I have 4 children, and as we were just saying, they've been to school and done their schooling in 12 different countries around the world, because we traveled. And I specifically always wanted to do international work. I just got fascinated with that, but I specifically left the US and stayed away for decades because I was very concerned about the challenges of raising Black men in the United States, and just decided I didn't want to deal with some of those things. It was time for me to take them someplace where they had a higher chance of being safe. And it's a decision that I'm so glad that I made. They're amazing people, and glad to have them in my life. And now I have a grandson, so that's a big part of my life as well. So, yeah, I mean, it's deceptively easy sometimes as an academic to talk about all the academic accomplishments, because you're encouraged to talk about what you've written and what you're researching. And I'm really happy about that, because I am my all in my family, my mother and brother also have doctorates. So I was very lucky there. I'm second generation. My mother was first generation college, and she went all the way through. So, but I know that it's a real privilege, and to be a tenured faculty member as a Black woman in this country is no small feat. And so I'm really aware of the privilege that brings, and also very proud of being able to accomplish that. So I think that's me. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And as we were saying, there's so many overlaps in our background. And I grew
Mm.
up as the international kid, like your kids did, and lived in similar countries, actually. I didn't live in 12. I lived in a total of 4 countries growing up, not 12. Um, but I went to, international schools and did that whole thing. And yeah, my family, yeah, we have lots of overlap in that way. And then a lot of overlap in the social and environmental justice passion that I think we both carry, me more in the world of social work and you in lots of work that you do. And yeah, and we could have a conversation about so many topics. Yeah. So it's wonderful. Um, but for the sake of time, given that we don't have 3 weeks to talk right this second, um, one of the things that really comes up for me as I'm listening to you is the fact that you are an academic and that you are very well respected in the academic world. And I also have a really strong academic background, although I chose not to go into academia itself, but I could have, right? And my my kid's dad did the Harvard and the PhD thing and all of that. I could have gone into that world. I didn't. Um, but I've been very influenced by it and I really value it. And in my work now and in the calling that I feel for myself and I feel in general for all of us, we're really looking for solutions to save a very hurting planet, basically, right? And so I think in academia, not always, but often, part of the goal there is to be finding solutions to help our world. And I know with you that is definitely your goal. You on many fronts, you're ultimately trying to help our world, and you recognize the deep pain that's happening. And so something that comes up for me a lot, and is probably the top theme in my own work, is that that I did start out in that academically oriented route, and then I went into social work, which also is relatively secular and mind oriented, although somewhat emotionally oriented, of course. But then I came to a point several years ago where essentially the rest of me became very loud. My soul became very loud and started saying essentially, that's great. The mind is great. Academia absolutely has its place. Even psychotherapy and social work absolutely have their place. Here's the big missing piece. You and most humans in especially this realm of cultural experience have forgotten whatever percentage, 90 something percent of who you actually are as a being, not only of mind and somewhat heart, but also mind, heart, body, earth, soul, spirit, cosmos, existence, all of the above, right? And so what I get told by the spirit world and just in myself really strongly is that when we're looking for these solutions for our world, that some of it will come through the rational mind, but most of it probably is going to come through all of who we are, not just the mind. So yeah, there's so many questions I could ask about that, but I could just start right there. Is there anything in particular coming up for you when I say those things?
Yeah, thank you. Those are such wise sentiments, and I think you're absolutely right. It's this rational thinking, especially the dualism of the Enlightenment, which separated our mind from our spirit, from rationality, and materiality, from a belief in animism and spirituality. It separated. Um, um, Nature from culture, right? That these are the things that created the problems we're in. So we're hard pressed to think that that's how we're going to solve it. Absolutely. And then, of course, along with that, you have colonialism's violent suppression of indigenous ways of knowing the world. And colonialism was a lot of things, but one thing it was definitely was a suppression of different forms of knowledge. And anything that was not rational according to European Enlightenment thinking was literally killed, right? It was considered dangerous. And then it was also surrounded by this religious framework that said, that looked at these things and said, if this doesn't look like or feel like or approximate our religious understanding as well as our understanding of rationality, then it is dangerous and it needs to be eliminated. These people are inferior, their knowledge is inferior, etc. So there's always been this very uncomfortable kind of relationship between Western knowledge and rationality and my formal education, no doubt about it. But most Western formal education, which not only teaches us one way to think, but also suppresses our natural instincts to think in other ways or to recognize that there are other ways of knowing the world and of being in the world. And so when you're in academia, to speak about the body, let alone to speak about love or to speak about the spirit, those things are frowned on.
Yeah.
And yet they are being done, and which it makes me happy. And there's no question that myself being in the position of privilege, of having tenure and being an older scholar and not trying to build my career, I can speak in ways that I know some of my colleagues cannot. So I feel compelled to do that and to really just push back on this taboo that you can't have spirit and science together. These are artificial divisions that we've made that are absolutely irrational. I'm not the first one to talk about, the importance of bringing love, for example, into academic work or into our movement, our social justice works. There's been so many other scholars, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, we could go on, who have said that we need to acknowledge and bring these things into even Western ways of thinking. So yeah, it's academia is great. It's been an amazing platform for me, especially. I really love doing research. So I'm somebody who likes to dig into things. And so it works really well for me, but I'm well aware that it has a lot of limitations. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge and address those, right? It's not just saying it, but then how do we rebalance? It's a matter of finding balance. And how do we acknowledge the epistemic violence that has gone on against other forms of knowing, other ways of knowing that are centered in nature, in the body, in the spirit? How do we remind ourselves that those are valid ways of being in the world?
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And so I don't want to linger too much on the kind of naming the negative, but I'll give one example, and then I would love to move on to the what next. Like, what are the solutions? I'd like to focus mostly on the positive and the solutions, but I do feel like maybe it might be helpful to hear, for people to hear one example I'm thinking of, and obviously you can name something. If I'm sure there are many, you have many. I'm sure we all have many examples, but one example for me personally is uh my great grandfather immigrated from Scotland, and we, I've known that my whole life, but and so it's my mother's father, and um my mother and I have always been drawn to Scotland, like the land of Scotland. So we've been there several times, but it wasn't until we physically, the second time I physically went there, and she and I were there together so many years ago, that we started to realize that our family, my mother's grandfather's family, was native Gaelic speaking. So that's not very many generations ago at all, right? um, it's her grandfather had grown up in a Gaelic family. But even now, even just a few years later, that was wiped out of our family knowledge. So what ended up happening for my mom is that she ended up going and studying Scottish Gaelic, and she's been doing that for years, and she's close to fluent-ish. So, she really, really reclaimed that in herself, which is amazing. And I have been to Scotland several times, and just the land there speaks to me. All these things started coming back alive in me also at the same time. But then what's also so interesting, so that was, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm sure you know, for anybody who doesn't know, what happened in Scotland, of course, is one of so many examples around the world where the colonialist English people in authority literally forced Gaelic speaking people to not speak their language, not practice their religious or spiritual practices. They were only supposed to essentially become English, and that was the only option, or they would be killed or their land was taken away, all those things, right? So infinite examples all over the globe of that happening. And then to kind of go along with that, what I find so interesting, even reflecting on it right now as you're talking, because I'm seeing the connection between these two things. a few years ago, I was on Facebook and I'm Facebook friends with several people from my college days, including some of the professors. And I went to a little tiny liberal arts school, is academically very good and politically extremely liberal and all those things, right? So it fits with my values in all kinds of ways. The one thing though was that on the academic side of things, spirituality of all kinds was big time a no-no. So so here I was, 20 years later or whatever on Facebook, and I saw a post by one of my old English professors, and she had put a post on Facebook asking people, largely her previous students like me, asking people to name what she called bad books. And what she meant by this, I'm not kidding you. The examples that she gave and other people started giving were so what she said was what she meant by bad books was like, give me some examples of books that you might have read as a teenager or a young adult that you realized later were really bad. So some of the examples then that came up were things like The Mists of Avalon, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, all these spiritually oriented books, right? Which I read at that age. Yes, I did, age 15, 16, 17, 19, 20, And maybe I haven't looked at those books since then, but and I probably would go back and look and think, oh, these are kind of simplistic, especially the Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I'm guessing I would feel that way, but I would never ever label them as bad because they were pivotal to my awakening to my own spiritual knowing, which was crucial to so many aspects of my life, and including the work I do now, right? That helps a lot of people. So you get my point that what was being put down was actually the spirituality, very much related probably in some way to my ancestry, that had also been stamped out by the colonialist way of being, right? And here's academia perpetuating that however many years later. Like, what are we doing? Not cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, those are fascinating stories for sure. I mean, if you think about language and language loss, and you think about the settler colonialism in this part of the world, I mean, it's tremendous, because there was just such a forced and purposeful, directed attempt to separate indigenous peoples from their who they are, and a lot of that happened through language, and it was very violently done, and people lost their lives over, especially children, as we're finding out, for example, in some of the recent Canadian um, unearthing, literally, of burial grounds around boarding schools. So it's no joke to take a people's language, and then to recover that language requires so much effort, because if we lose our elders, we lose original speakers of the language. And somebody else said this, but you are the language you dream in, right? And so you're not just removing people's ability to communicate, which is what language is, but that also determines how you dream, in that sense of what your dreams are, how you enter the spiritual world, all of what dreaming means. As a traveler like yourself, language became a very important part of my learning, right? And I was fortunate that I wasn't an American who only spoke English, so that was good. But I wasn't fluent in the languages of the countries that I was going to. And I just remember this one story in Bangladesh where we both had some experience, where I recognize that language means more than just words.
Yeah.
And that's because if you ask somebody in Bangla if they are hungry, you ask them what translates to, have you had rice yet? Bahat kore. And
Mm.
so that was a really good example for me of where hunger is not, what does it mean that hunger means rice, right? Like, what does that say about the culture? That's a whole different question than are you hungry? And I just love that. And it was really a lesson for me. So I think that's one important part of your story. And I think, yeah, the suppression, I don't know what a bad book is. I don't know what that criteria is. And I think right now that's a very fraught question because the books of my people certainly are being banned left and right. The book African American History is going through a moment of being not only denigrated but actually suppressed. And books are being banned, and and librarians are being persecuted, and libraries are having their funding taken. So I mean, this is serious stuff, right? All in the suppression of wanting to have knowledge and beautiful books. I think we can probably agree on some books that are absolutely stunning, but I don't know if we can agree on what's bad. And so some of those books that are so important to our history and our culture being banned, and the history being banned. I mean, it's a serious question and very confusing. What did you mean by a bad book? The power of the word is really about what moves us at the time that we read it. I mean, there are some books that I would say are not well written. So maybe mean bad by that, their use of language or their sophistication, sure. I read a lot of student writing, so I would never call any of my students writing bad. I would not do that. It is not. But there's some that is more sophisticated or gets ideas across clearer. So maybe on that level. But when you're talking about books, yeah, I think, different things speak to us at different times of our lives. And as we were saying before, we're always developing. We don't stop developing. We think of childhood development, adolescence, and maybe into young adult. And then there's kind of this that's it quality to it. And that's not it at all, right? We continue through these developmental stages. And so often the written word, whether we're reading it now or listening to it, which is also quite common, the words speak to the developmental stage that we're at and somehow connect with us on a level beyond mere teaching. And I mean, writing is a form of art. When you get a degree in writing, you get a master's of fine arts. And I feel strongly that literature and writing are critical artistic expressions. And so in that sense, what is bad art? Again, you can maybe agree on things that you don't find tasteful or sophisticated, but if something speaks to you, then you have a right to view that as art and maybe even explain why it is. So this is a fascinating question that teacher asked.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And then of course another side of the same coin, um of the being, engaging with words and engaging with language and all of that is the expression of it, right? So another part of it I feel so strongly about in my own work with clients and what I'm seeing in the world so much right now, it also is, I would call it maybe a need for a revolution around us feeling safe to have our voice and to actually have our being move through ourselves, into the world. And of course, again, we don't need to go on and on about it. It's just true that uh, for various reasons, in all kinds of ways, most of us have had our voice not acknowledged, not honored, not welcomed, not cherished, not all of those things. And that feels absolutely crucial on many, many, many levels now.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I'm also reminded of the fact that there are many ways of knowing the world, and certainly there's no one way that you can call indigenous or indigenous knowledge. So I would never generalize about what that means. There are some things in common across groups that are now considered indigenous, and there are many peoples for whom personhood is defined differently than what we know as the West, and is extended as a concept out to more than humans. And in having this whole family of plants and animals and minerals in this kind of extended family of personhood, differently constituted, but still within this personhood, there's often an acknowledgement that humans have a certain way of using language and the arts, be that singing, music, dreaming, poetry, fine arts, any of those creative expressions. We are not the only species who does that, no question about that. But certainly humans have been assigned the role of using our absolute, whether it be, it's almost like we're driven to artistic expression, right?
Mhm.
And that is important because it's one of the things that we have to give the family of this planet, right? It's one of the things that we are giving to nature. It's one of the things that we are giving to our other more than human relatives. And I love that this is defined differently if you go from group to group, but that underneath it all is this question, what is the role of the human? And that's what we are, I think, all grasping with as we're faced with this kind of planetary crises that we're dealing with. What is our role here? And I love it when one of those roles is to use our a drive to creative expression to help bring the world into being and to keep it balanced and to help it heal. I think that's just such an amazing way to look at art and literature and writing and song and dancing, like to make that connection. That's something that we're driven to do, is a way that we fit in the whole. And it also pushes against that narrative of dominion, right? That kind of, I would say, warped Christianity, because I don't think it's the true Christianity, but it is certainly part of this myth that we have dominion over, that we're supposed to be in charge of. I think anything we can do to push against that and see ourselves as a part of is really helpful.
Yeah, like part of a web of
Mhm.
existence. Yeah. So again, so many ways we could go with this, but maybe one way would be right now, I would love to hear for you personally. I mean, what comes alive for you, given the context of all the hurt that is going on, all of what we've just talked about, and so much more? What what comes up in your being as solutions? What are you either personally drawn to be part of, or what do you see in the larger world as possible? What's there for you?
Yeah, that's a great and tough question. I often start with the thing I probably do the most, although I've had a little bit of a break from teaching. I spend a lot of time in the classroom and a lot of time sitting, especially with Gen Z students, with 19, 20-year-olds who are listening to me talk about all of these issues, especially around the environment and climate change. And then I'm listening to them talk about their lives at this point, right, which is an incredible point, your early 20s, late teens, early 20s. And often they will ask me that same question, like, what, okay, Dr. Ford, what's the answer, right? Do you like tell us what we do about this? And I always tell them, I'm not sure, but I do know a couple of things. One is that we all need to find what we're passionate about. And then go into it really deeply and figure it out, learn about it, learn with it, change our minds about it, like, but just really be committed to that. Um, and that we also have to realize that we're not in this alone. And so I will tell them, find your people. And that doesn't have to be a lot of people, but just your people are there. There are people that you share things with and want to learn and grow with, and don't feel as if the weight of the world is only on your shoulders, which unfortunately a lot of young people do feel that way. So I think anything for me right now, anything that supports community in the ways that I am able to, I can't do everything either. So, if these are the gifts that I have, can I be in a community that values those gifts, and where those gifts will be useful? And a lot of my activist work right now is around agricultural, food and farming justice, which for me is an environmental issue, it's a social justice, a racial justice, a class issue. So I love the fact that I get to work with those communities as kind of doing other things in the world. And those are my people, and so they help keep me honest as well. And I hopefully contribute to those communities. So that's one thing that's up for me. Hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think what else. There's so much going on. I'm making a huge transition in my life from working full time, like, being a real worker bee, into something that I don't call it the R word, but it looks like retirement, but it's not, right? So I find it hilarious, because
The
it's
R
not
word.
an easy transition at all. And so I'm laughing at myself as I'm going through this, but one of the things I do know enjoying doing is more artwork. So lately I've been looking to see if I can bring more of a full-time artist studio practice, bring more of that into my life. And if I do so, why? And also, how does it continue the work I've already doing on climate justice and making people aware of environmental issues? And, I'm certainly a writer, but how do I bring together both the writing academic side and the visual artist, that creative side? So a lot of what I'm working on right now is the science artist, right? The scholar creative, that transitional place, and the ways that as a scientist, I can tell you, I can, talk for an hour about climate change, and I can just, that's what I wanted to be able to do. I wanted to be able to explain sea level rise and melting ice caps and methane, and, like, it was important for me to understand that. And yet I know that sometimes as an artist, both as a writer and a visual artist, I can get further in moving people to make a change in their life than I can as a scholar. And so I really love that. I think the arts speaks to our heart, right? And that's what we're trying to do right now. We have the information. We know what's going on. We have the information. The scientists, even though they said, well, we think they know, right? Like, we really, it's not a lack of information. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to change people's hearts. We're trying to address this at a spiritual level. We're really trying to make a transformation right now, and so that for me is really interesting, and that's where I hope to put a lot of my energy, especially at this point in my life.
Well, and that really fits with what I was saying, that the message I keep getting told from my own work is is to is that it's so important to hold space for us to come back into all of who we are, because again, the solutions will partly come through that rational thinking mind, which is beautiful and so important. And that's, maybe, I don't know what tiny percentage of all of who we are. So doing things that are not only that mind, like the art and the coming back to the heart and coming back to spirit and all of that. Um, that's that's what's told to me by the spirit world, is that's really the crucial thing for us to be doing.
Mm.
Do you have a particular example that comes to mind that you would want to share?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been working on right now is climate grief.
Hmm.
So I also have a background in trauma, both from working in countries that were traumatized and working in war zones and kind of extreme situations. So I quickly realized I needed to understand more about trauma, and then having huge traumatic situations to deal with in my family as well. And so I wanted to see what's this relationship between trauma and the climate emergency, our environmental issues that we're dealing with, and climate grief is part of that. And so I've been addressing that on the level of saying, what will it take for us to really grieve so that we can also move on and change our behavior?
Yeah.
One of the art exhibits I do right now that I've actually taken around the world is a grieving table. So just like you have a table of condolences at a funeral,
Mm.
I've been setting up a table of condolences in my artwork so that people can sit at the table, and it's interactive. So they're interacting both with the work I've done, but they're also adding their own stories, which I then put to art, so to speak, the way you would put something to music. And that's been interesting to do, and really, I think, has moved people, I hope, as they address this, but again, from this heart-centered, emotional and spiritual level. So that's one thing I've been very interested in. What is climate grief?
That is beautiful. Do you happen to have an online version that people can?
I actually I don't, but good news, my website is under construction. I'm beyond being a Luddite. I'm just this really like clueless baby boomer who has been kicking and screaming against the internet for many years. But I finally do have a website. It's under construction and it should be up by the end of the month. So I'm super excited about that. It will have my artwork on it, my portfolio. And then
Yeah.
the next step will actually then be to put this particular project about climate grief into the website. So
That
by the end of the year, for sure, I will.
mm,
Yeah.
wonderful. Yeah. So this is a slightly different, but and maybe a little out there in a certain way. But I'm thinking of, as you're describing, that is actually something that's come up in my work just in the last 2, 3 weeks. Um, but I think it is very related. Is that so one of the big things I do in my own work is I'm an astrologer now, and this year I've been teaching an astrology course. But the thing is, the way that I'm being guided to teach astrology is unlike any astrology. Probably Heather is the closest to the way I practice astrology, and I studied with her for a year. So yeah, we're very, very aligned. Um, but how I'm being guided to do it is, even, I would say, a step further away from Heather. Uh, and although I'm excited to talk to Heather about this because this is, again, so brand new for me. So what's been happening in my astrology course, it just came alive in the last 2 or 3 weeks, is I've been recognizing this need to stop and pause, essentially to recognize and to grieve and to do radical forgiveness work. with the actual planets, with the actual with the planet Earth, with ourselves, and with the cosmos. Because, very long story, very short, we not only have colonized each other, we not only have colonized our planet, but we've also, in a sense, colonized our relationship to the cosmos and to the other planets and asteroids and all of it. So one example of many is our relationship to the planet Mars. So Mars we associate with war and all of that. And I've been doing research on the moons of all of the planets also, which is something I haven't heard any other astrologers incorporating the moons of the planets, but that's a whole other story. But so the moons of Mars are called Deimos and Phobos, which in Greek mean dread and fear. So we've named this planet, this beautiful being, right? Who is very similar actually to the planet Earth when you look at the actual astronomy of the planet Mars. And we named its moons, we named the planet after the god of war and actually the god of agriculture too, both. But we named its moons fear and dread. You get my point, right? Again, it comes back to language. It comes back to colonizing of a being. So what I've been actually doing just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I think most astrologers would look at me like I'm insane, but it feels crucial, actually. I've been holding these spaces with my students to come into honoring and reverence of ourselves and then of these planetary beings, to essentially say, we're sorry. We're so sorry that as humans, we have colonized you and we have projected all of this,
Right.
fear and all of that onto you. So number one, we're sorry. Number two, we honor you and we want to actually listen, actually be with you, which in this really interesting way is bringing in all kinds of my social work background, right? That, like, when I was working in child welfare services and I would be with a family who's going, was in major crisis, my fear, my goal was to walk in and to actually honor and listen to the actual beings I was with, and not hopefully, jump in and colonize them, which, as I'm sure does happen a lot in social work. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting turn of events in my own approach to astrology. And I think this theme of grief, of acknowledging the pain and the hurt that has been happening for eons in the way that we've approached so many forms of life, really, and then to ask for forgiveness, to give forgiveness, and to grieve it feels really key to making a shift.
Right. Right. Wow, that's fascinating. I want to hear more about that astrology. I mean, astrology is like one of the key areas where, most astronomers would call us flakes and New Age. I mean, there's immediate fear reaction to even talking about it. And yet, outside of the Western canon, it's a respected science and has been for millennia.
Wow.
And there's so much you can learn there. Um, I one funny story was, it was a while ago, I think before the Mars landing that we've had more recently. Something was going on with Venus, and an elder looked at me, an indigenous the story was through another elder, but an indigenous elder, and we were talking about Venus, and they just turned and said, our people have already been there. And then just kept the conversation going. And so for me, that's like, right. Okay, like, yeah, don't forget, Claudia, that the paradigm that people want you to be stuck in is only a paradigm. And the fear part of it makes us miss out on just the richness and beauty of all of these other ways of interpreting the beauty and mystery of our cosmos, right? And for me, astrology was very personal. My mother had the foresight to have a reading done for me when I was 17 as a birthday present. She gave me this printout. In fact, it was a computer printout. And it just went for pages saying, you do this, you're like this, you do this. And at 17, my mind just went, because I could not imagine. It's like, how do you know me? Nobody knows me, right? You're 17. You're trying to figure out who you are. And then all of a sudden, this piece of paper comes out. And I'm like, what? Like, I am known. And so, from that, literally from that point, for me, it was, what can this way of knowing tell me about myself?
Mm.
It's just a quest, a constant, and it still is. What can I learn about who I am, why I'm here, what I'm meant to do, how I'm supposed to relate to the world from this particular way of knowing the world and the heavens? So I'm really, really glad that you're doing that, because I do think that opens up another way of knowing,
Mm.
reclaiming the names of things is super important. Right?
Mhm.
Why did we call them that? I mean, yeah, very
Yeah,
exciting.
fascinating. Yeah. Um, so I know you need to go in a minute here, and if you feel like you have time, I would love to just ask you one more question. Um, which I've heard you talk about the need for us to move from a global mindset to a planetary mindset to a cosmic mindset. Is that true? Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I've heard you describe the global to planetary, but I would love to, I mean, just a 30-second, have you touch on how you position us as, more of the cosmic beings and the beings of.
2 seconds. That's
Yeah,
impossible, but
I know. So I
but
don't want to
no,
end without hearing that.
well, I think when we think as a planet, then we're forced to realize our interdependence. It comes from the blue dot issue, right? We are this amazing, actually, it's a miracle, um, in this ocean of darkness that it has no right to even be, and yet we are, right? So let's deal with that. And I think um, the planetary point of view steps out and sees that, right? It sees us in as this blue dot in the sea of stars and darkness that is our cosmos. But then it also, if we are a planet, we fit into a cosmic framework, and the cosmos is both this astronomical and physical, kind of world, a universe, but then it also is a very internal thing as well.
Yeah.
And I always think that the balance there is, if if we were to say, what's one thing that I can do immediately, I think it goes back to that knowing the self. Like, as much time as we spend, and not gazing at the self, not that kind of being preoccupied with, but actually understanding ourselves and anything that we're doing to really come into a fullness of who we are, and then see ourselves as earth beings, as planetary beings, as cosmic beings, then that is going to go a long way to us helping the world and as a whole, because it's impossible to be in that framework and not turn around and look at that blue dot and say, oh, we really are on this planet together. I mean, they were talking about that 2 days ago about the eclipse, right? And people just kept saying, this is bringing us together. And I wish it were true, and I hope if for a minute it did, and I'm sure it did. But I think it's that sense of when we see ourselves in that place, and that was a cosmic reality. It was the motion of these 3 different physical bodies that came together in this one moment. And that, to understand that, then you have to place yourself um, within that system, and that should open your heart. That's
Mm.
what I hope, anyway.
Mm. Beautiful. Wonderful. Um, well, to honor your time, I know we need to close. Is there any one last thought or wish or suggestion you would have to listeners who, again, I think a lot of people listening to this are beings who really are dedicated to helping our planet, just like you are, just like I am, all of that, and are probably sitting there with the how, the how do I, and all of that, all of those things, right? So is there any last word you would have for people?
Yeah, I think all of most of the hows are valid. So the way that you find is going to be uniquely yours. And I think, it's not like to get stuck and there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. There's certainly a heart-centered way to do it. And there are ethical and moral and justice imperatives for how we are in the world. There are things that we need to do to repair our relationships with other people, to repair our relationship with ourselves, and certainly to repair our relationship with the earth. So anything that we're doing that is headed towards repair and justice is putting us on the right place. And I think that should be kind of within your deciding framework of you're doing the right thing. Are you helping to repair the world?
Beautiful. I think for everybody listening, the answer is probably yes.
I hope so. I'm sure it is.
Yeah, wonderful. And if people want to be in touch with you, is there any particular way that would work for you or anything?
By next month, my website should be easy to find, just under Claudia J Ford. Yeah, so I think that will be fine. And there's a contact form there, so you can get in touch with me directly through that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claudia. Such an
Thank
honor.
you, Martha. It's been lovely to speak to you. And as you said, we could go on for hours on
Oh,
our mutual interests, but we'll do
on.
it. Maybe we'll do it again sometime.
I
Thank
would
you.
love that. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the work that you're doing as well.
Mm.